She has not worked a single day in her entire life." My father sobbed to the courtroom, wiping away non-existent tears as he sued me for stealing $4 million from my late mother's estate. What he did not know was that the sealed classified file my lawyer was about to hand the federal judge would freeze the entire room and expose his darkest secrets to national intelligence. My name is Naomi, and I am 33 years old. For as long as I can remember, my family treated me like a parasitic basement dweller, an antisocial disappointment who stared at computer screens while they lived their glamorous lives. But sitting in that federal courtroom, I felt nothing but ice-cold anticipation. Before I tell you how I dismantled their entire empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly gather evidence against people who thought you were too weak to fight back. The heavy oak doors of the United States District Courtroom felt like the gates of a coliseum. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone that barely masked the thick tension radiating from the gallery. Judge Abernathy, a notoriously strict woman with a reputation for suffering zero fools, peered over her reading glasses from the high bench. Her stern gaze shifted from the witness stand directly to me, bearing the full weight of a legal system that currently believed I was a monster. I sat perfectly still at the defense table. I did not slouch. I did not tremble. I just rhythmically clicked my silver pen. Click, click, click. It was the only sound I made as I watched the man who was supposed to protect me actively attempt to destroy my life under oath. My father, Richard, looked the part of a devastated, grieving widower to absolute perfection. At 62 years old, he had the silver-haired charm of a successful real estate developer, someone who was used to glad-handing city council members and charming investors out of their millions. He wore a conservative charcoal suit deliberately chosen to look respectable but somber. He gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles turning white for theatrical effect. "Your Honor, my daughter has not worked a day in her life," he testified, his voice cracking with expertly practiced emotion. "She lived rent-free in my house for 33 years. We gave her everything. We fed her, we housed her, we tried to encourage her to step outside her bedroom and join the real world. And the absolute moment my late wife passed away, Naomi maliciously drained $4 million from her trust fund." He paused to pull a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket, dabbing carefully at the corners of his eyes to ensure the court reporter noted his distress. He painted a picture of a lazy, entitled child sucking the life out of her gracious parents. Behind him in the first row of the gallery sat my younger sister Caroline and her husband Jamal. They were putting on a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. Caroline, the family golden child and a minor social media influencer, had dressed in muted colors for the occasion, clutching a crumpled tissue and burying her face in Jamal's shoulder every time my father's voice wavered. Beside her sat Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law, looking sharp in a custom-tailored navy suit that screamed Wall Street investment banker. Jamal was a smooth-talking, arrogant financial director who had always looked at me like I was something foul he had scraped off his expensive Italian loafers. He kept a protective arm wrapped tightly around Caroline, shaking his head in manufactured disgust whenever my father pointed a shaking finger in my direction. Jamal was the architect of their financial confidence. To them, I was just the weird sister who did not understand the value of a dollar. They genuinely believed I was too incompetent to understand a basic bank statement, let alone execute a massive wire transfer. Their arrogance was blinding. I stopped clicking my pen and placed it flat on the polished wooden table. My attorney Harrison, a brilliant former federal prosecutor who radiated a calm, unbothered energy, sat beside me taking meticulous notes on a legal pad. He did not object to my father's dramatic monologue. We had discussed this strategy extensively. We needed Richard to dig his grave as deep as humanly possible before we handed him the shovel. Let him spin his web of lies, let him portray me as the ultimate villain, let him lock himself into a sworn testimony that he could never walk back. I looked directly into my father's eyes across the room, and I did not blink. I saw the flash of uncertainty behind his tears, a brief moment of panic, because I was not reacting the way a guilty, terrified daughter should react. The prosecuting attorney, a high-priced shark Richard had hired to intimidate me, stepped out from behind his podium. He held a thick stack of papers in his right hand, brandishing them like a weapon. He approached the defense table with a predatory smirk, clearly believing he was about to deliver the final killing blow to my case. He slammed the documents down right in front of me, the harsh smack making several people in the gallery jump. The pages showed zero balances and empty accounts. The lawyer wanted me to crack to cry to beg for mercy. He leaned in close, resting his hands on my table, attempting to loom over me physically. "Tell me, Naomi," he sneered, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "How exactly do you explain the total liquidation of a $4 million trust exactly 48 hours after your own mother's funeral? To understand how my family ended up performing this desperate circus act in federal court, you have to rewind exactly 1 month. It was Thanksgiving night, the last holiday we would ever spend together under one roof. The setting was my father's sprawling colonial estate in the upscale suburbs of Virginia. The house was a monument to his ego, with its marble foyer, imported Italian chandeliers, and a dining room table long enough to seat 20 people. The air smelled of roasted turkey, expensive sage stuffing, and the underlying scent of simmering hostility that always accompanied our family gatherings. I was sitting at the far end of the table, wearing my usual uniform of a plain black turtleneck and dark slacks. I had never cared much for the designer labels that my sister Caroline obsessed over. She was sitting opposite me, dripping in a silk dress that probably cost more than my first car, her perfectly manicured hand resting intimately on Jamal's arm. My father sat at the head of the table, carving the turkey with the aggressive precision of a man who needed everyone to know he was in control. My mother had passed away only 2 weeks prior, and her absence left a gaping hole in the room. But nobody was talking about her. They were talking about money. The meal had barely begun when Jamal cleared his throat and reached into the breast pocket of his custom suit. He pulled out a folded document, crisp and white, and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward me. It stopped right next to my water glass. "Sign it, sis," he said, his voice smooth and condescending, the kind of tone he reserved for people he considered hopelessly beneath him. "It is a power of attorney. Let me manage Mom's estate. The trust fund is complex and you spend all day staring at computer screens in the basement. You do not even know how to pay a basic utility bill. What are you going to do with $4 million? I looked at the document and then up at Jamal. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. My mother had been the only person in this family who truly saw me, who understood that my quiet nature was not a symptom of incompetence. She had deliberately bypassed my father and Caroline, leaving me as the sole trustee of her private accounts. She knew exactly what she was doing. I pushed the document back across the table. "No," I said simply. "I am not signing anything." Caroline scoffed, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "Oh, come on, Naomi," she whined, her voice taking on that shrill, grating quality she used whenever she did not get her way. "Do not be difficult. Look at yourself. You are 33 years old, single, and you dress like you are going to a funeral every day. You do not travel, you do not invest, you do not even have a real job. What do you need that kind of money for? Buy a million cats. Jamal is a professional. He knows how to handle large sums. Dad needs that capital to secure the permits for his new luxury resort project in Miami. Be a team player for once in your life." The luxury resort project. The legendary development my father had been bragging about for 3 years that had mysteriously stalled right around the time the federal government started looking into his domestic accounts. I knew exactly why they needed that $4 million. They were drowning in debt and desperate for clean cash to cover their tracks. But I could not say that yet. The investigation was ongoing. I picked up my fork and took a slow, deliberate bite of turkey. "I am not signing it," I repeated, my voice steady. "Mom made her wishes clear. The trust is under my name and it stays under my name. I will manage the funds exactly as she instructed. The reaction was explosive. My father slammed his carving knife down onto the silver platter, the loud clang echoing through the room. His face flushed a dark, angry red, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched collar. "How dare you!" he roared, standing up so quickly, his heavy oak chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "How dare you sit at my table, eat my food, live under my roof, and disrespect me like this? That money belongs to this family. It belongs to my business. You are nothing but a parasite, Naomi. A useless leech who has sucked the life out of us for over 3 decades." He reached out and grabbed the edge of my plate, flipping it upward. Mashed potatoes, gravy, and slices of turkey went flying across the table, splattering against my sweater and falling onto my lap. Caroline shrieked, pulling her silk dress back to avoid the mess, but she was smiling. She loved watching my father tear me down. Jamal just sat back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me with a smug, satisfied expression. He thought I would break. He thought I would cry and apologize and beg for their forgiveness. "Get out!" my father screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward the front door. "Get out of my house. If you want to keep that money, you can figure out how to survive on your own. Pack your bags and leave right now. Do not ever show your face here again until you are ready to hand over what rightfully belongs to me." I did not scream back. I did not cry. I slowly stood up, taking a napkin to wipe the gravy off my hands. I looked at the 3 of them sitting in their beautiful house, surrounded by their expensive things, completely blind to the reality of their situation. "I am leaving," I said, my voice dropping to a low, calm register that finally wiped the smirk off Jamal's face. "But do not pretend you are kicking me out because I am a parasite. You are kicking me out because you are terrified, and you should be." I walked out of the dining room, leaving my ruined dinner behind. I went upstairs, packed my clothes and my encrypted laptops into 2 suitcases, and walked out the front door into the freezing November rain. As I loaded my bags into the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from the rain. It was a text from Jamal. "Cards declined yet. Let us see how long a jobless loser survives in the real world. Surrender the 4 million or you will be sleeping on the streets by Monday." I read the text twice. Then I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove away from the only home I had ever known. They thought they had won. They thought they had stripped me of my comfort and forced my hand. But as I merged onto the highway heading toward the city limits, I was not thinking about how to survive. I was thinking about how to build the tightest, most inescapable federal indictment the Department of Justice had ever seen. The hunt had officially begun. That memory of Thanksgiving fueled me as I sat in the courtroom watching my father play the victim. When his attorney slammed that bank statement on my table, demanding to know where the $4 million went, I simply looked at my lawyer, Harrison. He gave a microscopic nod. The judge adjourned the preliminary hearing for the day, leaving the threat of criminal charges hanging heavy in the air. My father and Jamal strutted out of the courtroom like they had already won the war. I gathered my files and walked down the courthouse steps into the blinding midday sun of the city. The game was escalating, and my family was about to show me just how dirty they were willing to play. I walked 2 blocks to a small coffee shop to debrief with Harrison. I approached the counter and ordered a black coffee, pulling my personal debit card from my wallet. I swiped it at the register. The machine beeped a harsh red error message. "Declined." The barista frowned and politely asked me to try again. I swiped a second time, making sure the magnetic strip was clean. "Declined." I pulled out a backup credit card, a line of credit I had maintained perfectly for over 10 years. "Declined." A cold realization washed over me. I stepped out of the line and pulled out my phone, logging into my mobile banking app. My checking account, which held my modest government salary savings, showed an available balance of $0. A glaring red banner across the screen indicated that the account had been frozen, pending an internal fraud review. Jamal had made his move. As an investment banking director, he had the high-level connections and the utter lack of morals required to flag my personal accounts for suspicious activity. He was using his network to illegally choke off my access to my own money, hoping to starve me into submission. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me crawling back to my father begging for a handout so they could force me to sign over the trust. While I stood on the sidewalk staring at my frozen bank accounts, my phone vibrated with a notification from Instagram. It was Caroline. She was broadcasting live to her hundreds of thousands of followers. I tapped the notification and watched my sister put on the performance of a lifetime. She was sitting in the back of Jamal luxury SUV, dabbing her eyes with a designer tissue. Her makeup was perfectly smudged to look distressed but photogenic. "Guys, I usually keep my family life private," she told her camera, her voice quivering with manufactured heartbreak. "But I have to speak my truth today. My older sister Naomi has done something unforgivable. My mom just passed away and Naomi took advantage of her declining health. She stole $4 million from our family. She is an elder-abusing thief who is trying to ruin my father's business. Please send prayers for my dad. He is absolutely devastated." She stared into the camera lens with wide, innocent eyes, begging for sympathy. She knew exactly what she was doing, manipulating her audience to destroy my reputation before I even had a chance to speak. The comments section on her video was a waterfall of outrage. Strangers were calling for my arrest, tagging local police departments, and threatening to hunt me down. But the public smear campaign was not enough for them. They had to turn the rest of the family against me, too. My voicemail inbox began filling up at an alarming rate. I listened to the first message. It was from my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's sister who had always fawned over Richard Wealth. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" she shrieked into the phone. "Your father gave you a home, and this is how you repay him. You are a sociopath, Naomi. I hope they lock you up and throw away the key." The next voicemail was from a cousin I had not spoken to in a decade, calling me a greedy parasite who deserved to rot in a jail cell. The next was from an uncle threatening to come find me himself if I did not return the money to his brother. Message after message of pure, unadulterated hatred from people who had never once bothered to ask about my well-being. My family had successfully weaponized their entire social and professional circle against me. They were tightening the noose, trying to cut me off from every possible resource and every shred of human connection. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to break my spirit and force a rapid surrender. They genuinely believed that without their financial backing and social protection, I would crumble into a million pieces within a matter of hours. They drastically underestimated my level of preparation. I stood alone on the bustling city sidewalk, the noise of traffic rushing past me. I had no access to my personal funds. My reputation was being shredded in real time for hundreds of thousands of people to see. My extended family was ready to crucify me based on a carefully orchestrated lie. From the outside, it looked like I had been completely neutralized. Any normal person would have panicked under this immense pressure. Any normal person would have called their father crying and begging to surrender everything just to make the nightmare stop. But I was not a normal person, and I was far from defeated. Then my phone chimed with a new text message. It was from Jamal. He could not resist gloating. He desperately needed to rub my face in the dirt to prove his absolute dominance over my life. I opened the message, staring at the screen with a quiet calm. Cards declined, yet he wrote, "Let us see how long a jobless loser survives in the real world. Surrender the $4 million or you will be sleeping on the streets tonight." I locked the screen of my phone and slipped it back into my coat pocket. A normal person would have crumbled right there on the pavement, weeping at the prospect of losing everything. Jamal was banking on that exact reaction. He expected me to show up at my father's lavish estate begging for forgiveness and signing away my mother's trust fund just to get my debit cards unfrozen. Instead, I simply adjusted my collar, blended into the afternoon pedestrian traffic, and walked away. I did not head toward the affluent financial district where my father owned skyscrapers, nor did I go to the trendy neighborhoods Caroline frequented. I took the subway deep into the industrial sector of the city, transferring trains twice to ensure no private investigators were tailing me. I emerged in a neighborhood defined by cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, and abandoned warehouses. I approached a towering brutalist apartment complex that looked like it had not been renovated since the 1980s. The brick facade was stained with decades of city smog, and the front intercom system was entirely smashed. To the outside world, this was the kind of place where a jobless loser would end up after being kicked out of a wealthy household. It was the perfect cover. I bypassed the broken elevator and walked up 4 flights of dimly lit concrete stairs. When I reached apartment 412, I did not pull out a standard brass key. Instead, I placed my thumb against a concealed biometric scanner, disguised as a doorbell plate. A tiny green light flashed. I then entered a 16-digit randomized passcode on a hidden keypad. Heavy internal deadbolts unlocked with a loud mechanical thud. I pushed open the reinforced steel door and stepped inside. The interior of the apartment was a jarring contrast to the decaying hallway. There was no cheap furniture or peeling wallpaper. The walls were lined with soundproofing acoustic panels and floor-to-ceiling server racks humming with continuous heavy-duty processing power. Thick cables snaked across the floor connecting high-grade decryption modules. The windows were fitted with blast-proof glass and covered by blackout shades that blocked any thermal or visual surveillance. This was not a cheap rental for a family outcast. It was a fully funded, highly secure, United States government safe house. I took off my coat and tossed my wallet onto a metal desk. I pulled out the debit and credit cards Jamal had just illegally frozen and threw them directly into the trash bin. They were meaningless to me now. Those accounts contained my visible civilian salary, a carefully maintained facade to keep my family completely blind to my actual reality. I did not need Richard or Jamal to unfreeze my money. My real operational budget was drawn directly from the Department of the Treasury. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair positioned in front of a massive multi-monitor workstation. I tapped the keyboard, waking the system from its encrypted sleep state. The screens illuminated the dark room, casting a pale blue glow across my face. A federal login prompt demanded authentication. I slid my government-issued smart card into the reader and typed my clearance credentials. The system authenticated, immediately granting me access to the highest levels of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. For the last 5 years, my father and sister had mocked me for locking myself in my bedroom. They told their wealthy friends I was an antisocial shut-in who spent all day playing video games or reading blogs. They laughed at my plain clothes and my absolute refusal to engage in their flashy socialite lifestyle. They had no idea that while they were sipping champagne at charity galas, I was operating as a supervisory forensic accountant for the federal government. I specialized in dismantling transnational money laundering syndicates, and my current primary targets were the 2 men who thought they had just ruined my life. I opened my active investigation dashboard. Dozens of interconnected nodes lit up across the monitors, displaying the complex web of shell companies' offshore accounts and fake holding corporations my father had built. Richard thought he was a genius real estate developer. In reality, his domestic business was a crumbling house of cards, heavily leveraged and hemorrhaging cash. To keep his empire afloat, he had resorted to massive systemic wire fraud, defrauding investors and washing the stolen money through international channels. Jamal, with his pristine banking credentials, was the architect of the laundering process. They were a sophisticated criminal enterprise, but they were not invisible. I clicked on a cluster of red data points, representing the offshore flow. For months, I had been hitting a wall trying to trace the exact routing numbers Jamal used to funnel the stolen investor capital out of the country. They were careful keeping the digital paper trail fragmented. That was exactly why I needed the $4 million from my mother's trust. It was never just an inheritance. Under the strict authorization of a federal magistrate, that money had been legally classified as bait funds. I knew that Richard and Jamal were desperate for liquidity. I knew that if I dangled $4 million in front of them and refused to hand it over, they would eventually panic and make a sloppy, aggressive move to seize it. Jamal freezing my accounts was exactly the kind of arrogant overreach I had been waiting for. I pulled up the command terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard tracing the digital footprint Jamal had left when he accessed the banking network to lock my accounts. His arrogance had made him careless. He had used his secure terminal bypassing standard protocols, which gave me a direct backdoor into his encrypted routing history. The data began pouring into my servers, matching the missing pieces of the puzzle I had been hunting for 2 years. I smiled, watching the progress bar fill up on the primary screen. I typed a final command sequence to consolidate the indictment file. Target Richard and Jamal. Offshore tracing, Cayman Islands and Panama. Wire fraud evidence, 85% compiled. I was not a jobless loser about to sleep on the streets. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and the federal trap was almost ready to snap shut. The next morning, my burner phone vibrated with an alert from the perimeter security cameras at my civilian apartment. While I was safely operating out of the government safe house, my family launched a full-scale assault on my cover identity. Richard wasted no time escalating the pressure, wanting to break me psychologically before the next court date. I pulled up the live feed from my corridor and watched two heavy-set men in cheap suits pound their fists against my door at 3 in the morning. They were process servers hired by my father, wielding aggressive civil subpoenas. They kicked the door, demanding I come out and face the consequences of my theft. They thought they were terrifying a helpless woman. They had no idea they were screaming at an empty room while I monitored their biometrics from a federal bunker across the city. The harassment did not stop there. By noon, I made a physical appearance at my civilian address to maintain my cover. Stepping onto the street, I immediately spotted them. Richard had hired private investigators to tail me. 2 men in a dark gray sedan crawled along the curb, keeping pace with me. One man openly held up a camera, snapping photos to ensure I knew I was being watched. It was a classic intimidation tactic meant to induce panic. I simply let them take their stupid photos. I kept my head down, clutching my canvas tote bag, playing the broken daughter they expected to see. Every aggressive move was meticulously logged into my federal case file as evidence of witness intimidation. When I returned to my decoy apartment that afternoon, another trap had been sprung. A bright pink eviction notice was taped directly over the peephole of my front door. Before I could even read the bold print, the property manager, a sleazy man named Trent, who had always smelled strongly of cheap cologne and stale cigar smoke, stepped out of the stairwell. He blocked my path to the door, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and predatory amusement. "Your brother-in-law Jamal gave me a call," Trent sneered, leaning against the doorframe. "He told me about your little banking situation. Word is your accounts are frozen solid, and you are currently under investigation for stealing from your own family. I cannot have criminals living in my building, Naomi." Jamal made a very generous cash donation to the Property Management Fund to expedite your removal. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your trash and vacate the premises, or I am calling the police for criminal trespassing. Jamal was pulling strings from his corner office, using his dirty money to bribe corrupt landlords and systematically dismantle my civilian life. He assumed I was completely broke, defenseless, and panicking about where I would sleep the next night. I looked at the property manager, letting my shoulders slump in a display of manufactured defeat. I nodded silently, unlocked my door, and stepped inside. I spent exactly 10 minutes throwing some old clothes into a duffel bag before leaving the apartment for good. I did not need that decoy location anymore. Let Jamal think he had scored a massive victory. Let him believe he had successfully rendered me homeless and helpless. Every dollar he used to bribe that landlord was another wire fraud charge added to his rapidly expanding federal indictment. He was simply building the cage that would eventually hold him. The following day, I walked into a bustling local coffee shop in the downtown financial district. It was a calculated risk stepping into the territory my family frequented, but I needed to establish a physical presence near my attorney office for our upcoming strategy meeting. I ordered a simple black coffee and took a seat at a small table near the window. I had barely taken my first sip when the bell above the door chimed and a suffocating wave of expensive floral perfume hit me. I did not even have to look up to know who it was. Caroline marched right up to my table, her designer heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She was flanked by two of her wealthy socialite friends, treating this encounter like a spectator sport. She slammed her expensive leather handbag onto my small table, rattling my coffee cup. The entire cafe went silent as patrons turned to watch the spectacle. Caroline thrived on an audience, and she was ready to deliver a performance designed to humiliate me into the ground. "Look who it is," Caroline announced, her voice intentionally loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. "The thief of the century, enjoying your coffee, Naomi. Did you pay for that with the change you found on the street since Jamal locked up all your stolen money?" I slowly set my cup down and looked up at her. Her face was flushed with cruel triumph. She leaned over the table, invading my personal space, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Just sign the settlement," Naomi Caroline demanded, her tone dripping with absolute venom. "Dad might give you a $5,000 allowance so you do not starve. You have always been jealous of my marriage with Jamal, but stealing Mom's money will not make you any less pathetic." The cafe patrons whispered among themselves, staring at me with wide, judgmental eyes. Caroline stood tall, waiting for me to break down, crying, waiting for me to beg her to call off the lawyers and the private investigators. She expected me to crumble under the public shaming, to surrender the $4 million right there in the middle of the coffee shop. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I slowly picked up my white porcelain coffee cup, took a long, deliberate sip of the hot, dark liquid, and simply refused to react to her childish tantrum, letting the silence hang heavy between us. Caroline stood waiting for the explosion she so desperately craved. When nothing came but the quiet clink of my coffee cup against the saucer, her face twisted into a mask of pure frustration. She let out a sharp, dramatic scoff, grabbed her expensive handbag, and stormed out of the cafe with her two silent friends trailing behind her. I finished my coffee in peace, left a generous cash tip on the table, and walked out the back exit. I spent the next 45 minutes weaving through crowded subway stations, utilizing standard federal counter-surveillance techniques to completely lose the private investigators my father had hired. Once I was certain my tail was broken, I hailed a cab to the Marina District. The location I chose was a private members-only reading room tucked away above a maritime antiquities shop, requiring 2 keycards for entry. I walked into the dimly lit mahogany-paneled room and found Harrison waiting at a corner table. Harrison was a 55-year-old former federal prosecutor who operated one of the most ruthless corporate defense firms in the city. To my father, Harrison was just a high-priced bulldog I had managed to retain. They assumed he took my case on contingency, hoping for a cut of the money. They were entirely wrong. Harrison stood up the moment I crossed the threshold. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket and extended a hand, his demeanor shifting into one of profound professional deference. "Good afternoon, supervisory agent," he said, his voice kept low. "I hear Richard and his son-in-law are escalating their amateur intimidation tactics." I shook his hand, taking the chair opposite him. You could say that I replied. "Jamal used his banking credentials to freeze my civilian accounts yesterday, and Richard sent process servers to my decoy apartment. They operate under the delusion that I am a terrified civilian." Harrison let out a dry chuckle, opening his leather briefcase. "Their arrogance is truly a sight to behold. I have reviewed the filings their civil attorneys submitted to the probate court this morning. Richard is demanding an emergency injunction to seize the trust funds, claiming you are a flight risk. They are throwing everything at the wall." He slid a thick manila folder across the polished table. "But more importantly, here are the sealed financial warrants you requested from the federal magistrate. We have full authorization to monitor traffic on Jamal corporate servers." I opened the folder and scanned the signed judicial orders. Satisfaction settled in my chest. This was the exact leverage I needed. My family thought they were playing a game of civil probate law, trying to bully a relative out of an inheritance. They had no idea they had stepped onto a federal chessboard where stakes were measured in decades of prison time. Thank you, Harrison, I said, slipping the documents into my bag. This gives us the green light for the next phase. Jamal thinks he holds all the cards. It is time to remind him that the house always wins. I pulled a sleek encrypted tablet from my tote bag and set it on the table. The device was disconnected from the civilian grid, routing its signal through multiple secure government proxies to ensure complete anonymity. I logged into a specialized secure communications portal. Harrison watched quietly, knowing better than to interrupt a federal agent while she was setting a digital snare. "What is the play?" he asked, after a moment taking a sip of his sparkling water. "I am going to send Jamal a ghost message," I explained, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. Jamal is a smart man when it comes to washing dirty money, but his ego makes him incredibly reactive. Right now, he is riding high on the adrenaline of freezing my bank accounts. He feels untouchable. I am going to introduce a microscopic drop of poison into his perfect ecosystem and watch how fast the infection spreads. I created a dummy email address spoofing the domain to perfectly mimic the internal compliance and auditing department of the massive investment bank where Jamal served as a director. To any casual observer or automated spam filter, the email would appear as a routine internal inquiry regarding a flagged transaction. I drafted the message with cold, calculated precision. I did not include any threats, any demands, or any mention of my name. The subject line was simply listed as "Urgent Compliance Review Required." In the body of the email, I typed a single line of text. It was not a sentence, just a sequence of alphanumeric characters. Specifically, it was a highly classified tax identification number belonging to a shell company registered in Panama. It was the exact shell company Jamal had been secretly using to launder my father's fraudulent real estate funds for the past 2 years. To anyone else, that string of numbers would look like absolute gibberish, but to Jamal, it would look like a loaded gun pointed directly at his head. I double-checked the spoofed routing protocols to ensure the email would bypass his executive assistant's screening software and land directly in his personal secure corporate inbox. Harrison leaned forward, looking at the screen. "You are spooking the herd." He noted a slight smile playing on his lips. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the tablet. "I want him to think the bank internal auditors have stumbled onto his money laundering operation. I want him to panic. Because when Jamal panics, he makes mistakes. And when he makes mistakes, he leaves a digital trail straight to my father." I hovered my finger over the send button. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, insignificant, and powerless. They had pushed me out into the rain and tried to strip away my dignity. Now it was my turn to show them what real power looked like. I tapped the screen and sent the message into the digital ether. Across town, sitting in a sprawling glass-enclosed corner office overlooking the financial district, Jamal was riding an absolute high. He had spent the morning accepting praises from his junior analysts and sipping an overpriced espresso, completely satisfied with his own brilliance. In his mind, he had just executed a flawless checkmate against his pathetic sister-in-law. Freezing my civilian banking accounts was child's play for a man with his level of executive clearance. He leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit, and smiled at the skyline. He imagined me crying in some cheap motel begging for a handout. A soft chime from his primary workstation interrupted his gloating. An email notification popped up in the upper right corner of his monitor. The sender displayed as the internal compliance and auditing division of his own firm. Jamal frowned. Compliance rarely emailed directors directly unless a quarterly review was mandated. He clicked the icon opening the message. His eyes scanned the subject line stating "Urgent Compliance Review Required." He took a sip of his espresso, expecting a mundane corporate policy update. Then he read the single line of text in the body of the email. It was just a sequence of alphanumeric characters. To anyone else in the building, it would look like a typo or a glitch. But Jamal felt the blood instantly drain from his face. The espresso cup slipped from his fingers, clattering against the mahogany desk, and spilling dark liquid across his pristine blotter. He did not even notice the mess. His heart slammed against his ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. He recognized that exact sequence. It was the highly classified tax identification number belonging to the offshore shell company registered in Panama, the exact entity he used to funnel Richard and his dirty real estate capital out of the country. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He grabbed his mouse, clicking frantically to check the sender routing information, but the spoofed address held up perfectly. Breathing heavily, Jamal leaped out of his chair and rushed to the glass door of his office, snapping the deadbolt shut and pulling down the privacy blinds. His hands trembled as he pulled his personal phone from his pocket. He bypassed his recent contacts and dialed a heavily encrypted number he only used for communicating with my father. The line rang twice before Richard picked up, sounding thoroughly annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Jamal?" My father barked over the sound of clinking silverware and background chatter. "I am in the middle of a lunch meeting with the zoning commissioner." "We have a massive problem," Jamal hissed, pacing the length of his office like a caged animal. "Someone knows. I just got an email from internal compliance. They sent me the exact Panamanian tax ID, the one we use for the resort funds. Someone is auditing the offshore accounts, Richard. The feds or the bank examiners. Somebody has the number." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then my father let out a loud, abrasive laugh. "Are you out of your mind?" he scoffed. "Nobody is auditing anything. It is a phishing scam, Jamal, or one of our competitors trying to spook us before the quarterly earnings report. You are a senior director, for heaven's sake. Act like one. Stop panicking over a random spam email. It is not spam." Richard Jamal pleaded, wiping the sweat from his upper lip. "They sent it directly to my secure inbox. It bypassed all the firewalls. They have the specific ID. If compliance looks into that shell company, they are going to find the $12 million we transferred. We are going to go to federal prison." "Listen to me very carefully, you paranoid fool," my father growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, menacing whisper. "Nobody knows anything. The offshore setup is bulletproof. You built it yourself. You are letting your imagination run wild, and I do not have time to hold your hand. We are facing a massive liquidity crisis right now, and that resort project is hemorrhaging cash. We need capital immediately to cover our tracks. Keep your eyes on the prize, Jamal. We need to break Naomi and get that $4 million out of her trust fund before the quarter ends. That is our only priority. Do not touch the offshore accounts. Do not do anything stupid. Just focus on squeezing my worthless daughter until she signs the paperwork." My father abruptly ended the call, leaving Jamal listening to dead silence. But Jamal could not calm down. He paced faster, loosening his expensive silk tie. Richard was an arrogant old man who did not understand modern financial forensics. Richard thought his wealth made him invincible, but Jamal knew how quickly the federal government could dismantle a man if they found a single thread of dirty money. He looked at the email again, the alphanumeric sequence burning into his retinas. The walls of his luxurious corner office suddenly felt like a prison cell closing in on him. He could not just sit there and do nothing. He had to protect himself. If compliance was sniffing around the Panama Shell Company, he needed to create distance between his personal credentials and the offshore ledger. He needed to obscure the digital paper trail before an official audit was launched. Ignoring my father's direct orders, Jamal rushed back to his desk and unlocked his secure terminal. His fingers shook as he typed his administrative overrides. He bypassed the standard security protocols, logging directly into the offshore portal. He initiated a rapid series of unauthorized transfers, attempting to bounce a fraction of the illicit funds through a secondary proxy account in the Cayman Islands to confuse the auditing software. He thought he was being brilliant. He thought he was covering his tracks with untraceable financial gymnastics. Miles away in the dimly lit reading room, I sat across from Harrison, watching my encrypted tablet. For 30 minutes, there had been absolute silence on the network. Then a sharp, high-pitched chime erupted from my device. A bright red notification banner flashed across the screen, overriding the dark interface. The trap had sprung. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the incoming data stream. The spoofed email had worked perfectly. Jamal had panicked completely, disregarding his own sophisticated operational security. In his desperate attempt to hide the $12 million, he had logged into the offshore network using his direct corporate IP address. He was currently executing a panicked, sloppy wire transfer to the Cayman Islands, and my federal tracking software was recording every single keystroke. He was unknowingly broadcasting his exact digital signature, his encrypted routing numbers, and the entire historical ledger of his money laundering operation directly to my secure server. Got him, I whispered, a cold, victorious smile spreading across my face. He just handed us the keys to the entire kingdom. The decryption software on my tablet chewed through the incoming data packets, organizing Jamal's frantic offshore transfers into neat, undeniable ledgers of federal wire fraud. Harrison watched the progress bar fill up with quiet, professional awe. For a man who had spent decades fighting corporate corruption, seeing a target willingly walk into a digital snare was a rare treat. We sat in that dimly lit reading room, securing the data streams and ensuring the server logs were locked behind Treasury Department encryption walls. Once the download was complete, Harrison stood up, adjusting his tie. The federal side of this operation is moving faster than anticipated, he noted, picking up his briefcase. But do not underestimate your father in the civil arena, Naomi. Richard is backed into a corner, and cornered animals bite blindly. I will head back to the office and keep an eye on the probate docket. Stay sharp. I nodded, watching him leave before slipping back out into the city. I spent the next 2 days entirely off the grid, locked inside my government safe house, meticulously mapping the financial nodes Jamal had so generously provided. The $12 million my father had siphoned from his investors was perfectly traceable now. Every fraudulent invoice and every offshore shell company was laid bare on my monitors. The criminal indictment was practically writing itself. But Harrison was right about my father. Richard was bleeding cash, and the $4 million trust fund was the only lifeline he had left. He was not going to wait for a judge to slowly adjudicate the matter. He was going to escalate. On Thursday afternoon, my secure cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Harrison's direct private line. I muted the audio on my surveillance feeds and picked up. I could immediately tell by the rigid tone of his voice that the situation had shifted. The usual dry banter was gone, replaced by the sharp, clipped cadence of a defense attorney preparing for war. "We have a situation," Naomi Harrison said, cutting straight to the chase. "I just had a courier drop a massive stack of filings on my desk from your father's legal team. They are escalating the timeline significantly. They just filed an aggressive motion for an emergency deposition. They want you in a conference room, on the record and under oath, by next Tuesday." I leaned back in my leather chair. "A deposition is standard intimidation," I replied. "They want to put me in a room with their high-priced corporate sharks and rattle me until I slip up or agree to sign a settlement. Let them try. I have nothing to hide regarding the trust. It is not just a standard intimidation tactic," Harrison warned, his voice dropping lower. "They are changing the narrative completely. Richard is no longer just arguing that you stole the money after the fact. He is attacking the foundation of the trust itself. He is going after your mother." My grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean he is going after my mother?" "They submitted a sworn medical affidavit attached to the deposition request," Harrison explained. "Richard hired a private psychiatrist, a doctor with a reputation for being a hired gun who provides whatever medical opinion his wealthy clients pay for. This doctor has submitted a fabricated evaluation claiming that your mother was suffering from advanced severe dementia during the final months of her life. He is stating on the record that she was completely cognitively incapacitated at the exact time she amended the trust to name you as the sole trustee." A cold, furious anger curled in the pit of my stomach. My mother had been physically weak at the end, battling a terminal illness that ravaged her body, but her mind had been razor-sharp until her very last breath. She knew exactly what Richard and Jamal were doing. She knew the family business was a criminal enterprise built on fraud. That was exactly why she legally transferred the $4 million to me, ensuring they could not touch it. To use her memory this way to label a brilliant woman as a dementia patient, just to steal her money, was a new level of depravity even for my father. They are painting a very specific and ugly picture, Harrison continued, pulling me back to the legal reality. Their official narrative is that you are an opportunistic predator. They are going to argue that you took advantage of a dying, confused woman, coercing her into signing away the family fortune, while she lacked the mental capacity to understand what she was doing. By legally invalidating her mental state, they are aiming to have the amended trust completely thrown out by the probate judge. If they succeed, the $4 million automatically reverts back to the primary estate which Richard controls. They are trying to retroactively seize the trust, and they want to use this deposition to trap you into a corner. The sheer cruelty of their strategy was breathtaking. They were willing to drag my mother's dignity through the mud and brand me as an elder abuser purely to save their own skin. Harrison paused, letting the gravity of the situation settle. We do not have to accept this, Harrison said, his tone shifting into protective mode. I can file an immediate emergency injunction to block the deposition. We can fight the subpoena, argue that their medical affidavit is entirely baseless, and tie them up in procedural motions for months. Say the word, Naomi, and I will shut this down right now. I looked away from the blank wall and turned my attention back to my workstation. The glowing monitors displayed the sprawling, undeniable federal evidence of Richard's massive wire fraud operation. I looked at the offshore routing numbers Jamal had frantically tried to hide. I looked at the criminal empire they had built on arrogance and lies. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. They thought they could rewrite history and bully me into submission using a fake doctor and a dirty legal motion. They desperately wanted to put me in a room and interrogate me. A slow, cold smirk touched the corners of my mouth. I picked up my phone. No, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. Do not block it. Let them depose me. Give them enough rope to hang themselves. Tuesday morning arrived with a sharp chill. I walked into the downtown high-rise, housing my father's legal team, wearing a simple gray cardigan and practical flat shoes. It was the exact wardrobe they expected from me, the uniform of a defeated, spineless woman completely out of her depth. Harrison met me in the lobby. He wore a tailored suit that contrasted perfectly with my plain attire. We rode the elevator in silence to the 42nd floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of white marble designed to make litigants feel small before they entered. A paralegal escorted us into a sterile, glass-walled conference room. The space was freezing, vibrating with engineered hostility. At the center sat a massive frosted glass table. A court stenographer was set up in the corner adjusting her machine. Then the double doors swung open and the circus arrived. My father entered first, flanked by his lead litigator, a man named Caldwell, who moved with the predatory grace of a shark. Behind them sauntered Jamal. My brother-in-law did not bother taking a seat at the main table. He claimed a leather armchair in the corner, crossing his legs and smoothing his custom Italian suit. He stared at my scuffed flat shoes and let out an audible scoff, shaking his head in manufactured pity. He looked at me like a stain on the carpet. My father took his seat across from me, and the performance instantly began. Richard let his shoulders slump, letting out a long, trembling sigh. He looked at the stenographer, offering a tragic, brave smile, the portrait of a heartbroken widower forced to endure the agony of confronting his treacherous daughter. It was an award-winning act. If I had not spent the week tracing his wire fraud operation, I might have believed him myself. Caldwell dropped a towering stack of file boxes onto the glass table. The heavy thud was a calculated acoustic intimidation tactic meant to rattle my nerves. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the glass. Let the record reflect that the deponent has been sworn in. Caldwell began, his voice booming in the enclosed space. He did not start with gentle background questions. He went straight for the jugular. Miss Naomi, let us establish a baseline for your professional and financial competency. Or rather, your complete lack thereof. When was the last time you held a conventional paying job in the civilian workforce? I kept my eyes downcast, playing the frightened shut-in perfectly. I have not held a civilian position in over a decade, I answered softly, letting my shoulders hunch forward defensively. Caldwell smiled, a cold flash of teeth. Over a decade. Fascinating. So for the entirety of your adult life, you have resided rent-free in your father's home, relying entirely on his generosity to feed and clothe you. You have never paid a mortgage, you have never navigated a corporate contract, and you have never independently managed a financial portfolio. Is that correct? Harrison shifted slightly in his chair but made no objection, letting Caldwell lay the foundation of their trap. That is correct, I replied, keeping my voice meek and submissive. Jamal snickered from his corner chair, shifting his weight to check his diamond-encrusted watch. The sheer boredom he projected was intentional signaling that my destruction was a foregone conclusion. Caldwell paced the length of the long table. So we have established that you possess zero financial literacy. Yet we are expected to believe that your late mother, a woman of substantial wealth and complex assets, suddenly decided to bypass her highly successful husband and her professionally credentialed son-in-law to hand her entire $4 million trust over to a woman who does not even know how to file a tax return. He stopped pacing and pulled a thick document from his files, sliding it across the glass table toward me. It was the medical affidavit Harrison warned me about, the fabricated psychiatric evaluation signed by their hired doctor. I want the record to reflect that I am presenting Exhibit A, Caldwell stated loudly. This is a sworn medical evaluation conducted just weeks before your mother's passing. It details a severe rapid onset of advanced dementia. It states unequivocally that she was suffering from acute cognitive decline paranoia and an inability to comprehend basic reality. Across the table, my father buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he acted out a profound wave of grief. The stenographer's fingers flew across her keys, capturing every manufactured sob for the official transcript. Caldwell stepped closer to my side of the table, invading my personal space. His shadow fell over me. He pointed a sharp finger at the medical file before me. Your mother did not know what year it was, Naomi. She did not know her own name some days. She was a vulnerable, terrified woman whose mind was deteriorating. And you, the daughter who contributed absolutely nothing to her household, saw an opportunity. Harrison remained perfectly silent beside me. To the untrained eye, it looked like my lawyer had given up, like the evidence was too overwhelming to fight. But beneath the table, Harrison tapped his foot twice. It was our signal. The trap was fully set. They had officially entered the fabricated medical assessment into the sworn record, committing federal perjury to support their civil theft. Caldwell leaned in close, pressing both hands flat against the glass table until he was inches from my face. You have no income, no employment history, and no financial literacy. It is a fact that your mother was entirely incapacitated by dementia, and you coerced a dying woman into handing over $4 million to fund your lazy lifestyle. Isn't that right? The echo of Caldwell shouting faded against the thick glass walls of the conference room. He stayed perfectly still, leaning over the table, expecting me to cower. He wanted tears. He wanted a frantic denial. He wanted the court stenographer to record the erratic, defensive stammering of a guilty woman breaking under pressure. My father watched from across the table, holding his breath, ready to perform his next act of sorrow the moment I cracked. Jamal smirked from his leather chair in the corner, practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction, waiting for my inevitable collapse. I did not blink. I did not lean back. I held Caldwell's aggressive stare with an expression of absolute Arctic boredom. The silence stretched until it became suffocating. The stenographer's hands hovered frozen over her keyboard, waiting for my verbal surrender. No, I said, my voice remarkably quiet, even and entirely devoid of any human emotion. That assumption is not right at all. I slowly reached down into my canvas tote bag. Caldwell straightened up his heavy brow, furrowing as he tried to anticipate my next move. He probably expected me to pull out a crumpled tissue or a messy stack of meaningless civilian bank receipts. Instead, my hand emerged holding a small encrypted silver USB drive. I did not hand it to Caldwell. I placed it flat on the glass table and slid it 2 inches to my left, stopping precisely in front of Harrison. Harrison did not ask any questions. He did not hesitate. He picked up the silver drive with a smooth, practiced motion. He turned his expensive leather chair and faced the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall of the sterile conference room. "What is this?" Caldwell barked, his previous theatrical dominance instantly replaced by sharp legal paranoia. "We have not been provided with any digital discovery exhibits prior to this session. You cannot introduce unverified media into a formal deposition without prior opposing counsel review. I object to this entire stunt and demand it be stricken from the record." Harrison ignored him completely. He plugged the USB drive into the port beneath the monitor and picked up the remote control. "This is a direct rebuttal to Exhibit A," he stated, his voice slicing through Caldwell's bluster like a federal scalpel. "You entered a sworn medical affidavit claiming the deceased was suffering from severe cognitive decline during the final months of her life. You made her mental capacity the central pillar of your aggressive interrogation. We are simply providing the necessary visual context to ensure the official record reflects the undeniable truth." "I demand you stop that playback immediately," Caldwell ordered, slamming his open palm on the table. "Richard, tell your daughter to stop this nonsense." My father had half risen from his chair, his face suddenly draining of all color. Jamal stopped checking his diamond watch and sat up straight, his posture suddenly rigid. They had built their entire legal strategy on the assumption that my mother was gone and could no longer speak for herself. They arrogantly assumed the dead could not testify against the living. Harrison calmly pressed play. The large screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, sterile glow across the tense faces in the conference room. The video quality was crystal clear, captured in high definition. A digital timestamp sat permanently in the bottom right corner of the frame. The exact date and time indicated it was recorded exactly 3 months prior to her passing. This perfectly overlapped with the time frame of their fabricated psychiatric evaluation. The camera angle was steady, positioned directly at the foot of a hospice bed. My mother sat propped up against a stack of crisp white pillows. Physically, she looked frail. Her frame was painfully thin, her skin pale from the terminal illness that was slowly shutting down her internal organs. A clear oxygen cannula rested beneath her nose. But the moment she looked directly into the camera lens, any manufactured illusion of dementia evaporated instantly. Her eyes were sharp-focused and burning with a fierce, unyielding intelligence. There was absolutely no confusion in her gaze. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a woman who knew exactly what was happening around her. My father let out a sharp, strangled gasp, his knuckles turning white as he clutched the edge of the glass table. "Hello, Naomi." My mother's voice echoed through the conference room speakers. Her tone was raspy from the illness, but her enunciation was flawless. "Today is Tuesday, October 12th. The time is exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. I am making this recording of my own free will of sound mind and with absolute cognitive certainty." Caldwell looked like he had been struck by lightning. He turned to my father, his eyes wide with furious panic. "You told me she was entirely incoherent," he hissed under his breath. "You swore to me she could barely string 2 sentences together." My father could not answer. He was staring at the screen, completely paralyzed by the ghost of the brilliant woman he had underestimated his entire life. "I have finalized the amended trust documents this morning," my mother continued on the screen, her voice steady and deliberate. "I have intentionally bypassed the primary estate. I have deliberately excluded my husband Richard and my daughter Caroline. I am leaving the entirety of this trust to Naomi." Jamal stood up from his chair in the corner, his custom suit suddenly looking suffocatingly tight. He took a heavy step toward the table, his eyes locked on the glowing monitor. The arrogant smirk he had worn since Thanksgiving was completely wiped away, replaced by a profound, creeping terror. He knew my mother was a highly observant woman. He just never realized how closely she had been watching his financial maneuvers. My mother took a slow, deliberate breath on the video, adjusting her posture against the hospital pillows. She looked straight ahead, piercing through the digital divide directly into the souls of the corrupt men sitting across from me. My husband Richard and my son-in-law Jamal are involved in illegal activities that will ruin this family, she stated, her words dropping like heavy anvils into the silent conference room. I know about the missing investor capital. I know about the offshore routing in Panama. They have built a criminal enterprise masquerading as a legitimate domestic business. They are reckless, arrogant, and completely compromised. Naomi is the only one smart enough and clean enough to keep this money out of their dirty hands. She will stop their madness. The final word of the video hung in the freezing air. She will stop their madness. The screen faded to black, casting a stark reflection around the polished table. For a long, unbroken moment, nobody breathed. The court stenographer froze her eyes, darting nervously. Beside me, Harrison calmly unplugged the silver drive, letting the heavy silence stretch. My father Richard looked as though the blood had been violently siphoned from his body. He collapsed back against his expensive leather chair, his face turning ghostly pale. The arrogant flush from minutes prior was completely gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave to testify against him. Caroline let out a sharp, strangled gasp from the gallery section. She clamped both hands over her mouth, her perfect makeup unable to hide the sheer terror widening her eyes. She looked frantically at my father, expecting him to unleash his explosive anger to yell the video out of existence. But Richard remained paralyzed, staring blankly at the dark monitor screen. Caldwell stared at the empty space, his mind clearly calculating the severe ethical and legal ramifications of representing clients caught committing federal perjury. The undeniable clarity of my late mother was threatening to rip his legal license to shreds. Then a sound shattered the heavy silence. A slow, deliberate clap. Clap, clap, clap. Jamal stood up from his leather armchair in the corner of the room. He let out a low, resonant chuckle that oozed with toxic condescension. He uncrossed his legs, stood to his full height, and casually buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket. He walked slowly toward the center of the conference room, entirely unbothered by the devastating accusations my mother had just leveled against him. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and absolute disgust. "Bravo, Naomi Jamal," said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "A truly touching performance. I did not think you had the creative capacity to produce such a compelling piece of fictional cinema from the dark confines of your bedroom." He placed both hands flat on the frosted glass table, imposing his physical presence directly into my space. He locked his dark eyes onto mine, expecting me to flinch. I held my ground, keeping my expression entirely neutral. Jamal smiled a tight, predatory grin. "That was a cute home video," he whispered loud enough for the stenographer to capture every word. A desperate, emotional ploy designed to pull on the heartstrings of a sympathetic audience. "But we are not in a movie theater, Naomi. We are in a legal proceeding. And in the eyes of the law, that video is absolutely worthless." Jamal began pacing slowly behind my father's chair, adopting the cadence of a seasoned litigator. "Let us review the glaring structural failures of your little surprise exhibit," he announced. "First, there is no notary public present in the frame to authenticate the recording or verify the free will of the speaker. Second, there is no attending physician standing by to verify her mental state at that exact second. A person suffering from advanced dementia can have moments of perceived lucidity, but that does not legally negate an official medical diagnosis. And third, there is no independent legal counsel visible in the room to ensure she was not being fed a script from behind the camera." Jamal stopped pacing and leaned back against the glass wall. Because of those massive procedural voids, he continued, "That video is legally inadmissible hearsay. You cannot cross-examine a digital recording. A judge will take one look at the lack of formal authentication, compare it to our signed, sworn medical affidavit from a licensed psychiatric professional, and throw your little home movie out in 5 seconds flat. You thought you could walk in here and play a wild card, but all you did was prove how fundamentally ignorant you are of the legal system. Caldwell, hearing Jamal dismantle the video with cold procedural logic, snapped out of his paralyzed state. The color returned to his face as he realized his case might still have a pulse. "He is entirely correct," Caldwell chimed in, his aggressive, booming voice returning. "The video is an unauthenticated, highly prejudicial piece of digital media lacking any formal chain of custody. I will file an immediate motion to strike it from the record, and I assure you the magistrate will agree. It is a pathetic attempt to distract from the fact that you possess zero financial authority." Jamal let out a loud, booming laugh that bounced off the glass walls. He genuinely believed he had just completely neutralized my only weapon. "Did you really think a smartphone video could beat a team of elite corporate lawyers and a certified medical evaluation?" Jamal mocked, shaking his head. "You are out of your depth, Naomi. You should have stayed in the basement where you belong, instead of trying to play games with adults who actually understand how the real world operates." Hearing Jamal confidently tear my evidence to shreds acted like a shot of adrenaline for my father. Richard took a deep breath, pulling his shoulders back and puffing out his chest. The ghostly pallor faded from his skin, replaced once again by the arrogant flush of a man accustomed to crushing his opposition. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The facade of the mourning widower was entirely gone. In its place sat the ruthless real estate developer, who viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to his cash flow. "Well, Naomi," my father said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "You tried your stunt and it failed spectacularly. You have exhausted all your pathetic tricks and wasted my valuable time. The foolish little games end right now. You are going to sign the settlement agreement today. Hand over every single penny of that trust directly to my control. If you refuse me, I will instruct Caldwell to request immediate criminal charges against you for elder abuse and fraud. I personally will ensure you are prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. Sign the papers right now, before we destroy your life completely." The echo of my father's threat bounced off the thick glass walls of the conference room. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out with the aggressive satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He waited for my collapse. He wanted the complete and utter submission of the daughter he had always viewed as a worthless nuisance. Jamal stood behind him, adjusting his designer cuffs, a triumphant sneer plastered across his face. They had played their cards, and they believed their legal posturing had completely neutralized my only line of defense. I knew exactly what they needed to see to feel secure in their victory. I let my shoulders hunch forward, collapsing inward, like a fragile structure giving way under massive pressure. I lowered my gaze, staring blankly at the frosted glass table in front of me. I bit down hard on my lower lip, forcing a tremor into my jaw. I reached out and clasped my hands together on top of my legal pad, making sure my fingers shook visibly. It was a calculated performance, honed by years of surviving in a household where showing weakness was the only way to avoid their relentless wrath. I made myself look small, terrified, and entirely broken. Caroline let out a loud, dramatic sigh from the gallery section, breaking the heavy silence. She crossed her arms, rolling her eyes at my trembling hands. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Naomi!" she groaned, her voice thick with impatience and disdain. "Stop playing the victim and just sign the documents. You tried your little stunt and it blew up in your face. Do not make this any more embarrassing for yourself than it already is. Dad is offering you a way out. Take the settlement before he actually sends you to jail." Caldwell, sensing the blood in the water, immediately slid a thick stack of stapled settlement papers across the smooth glass. He uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and placed it deliberately next to the signature line. The legal jargon on the top page outlined the total surrender of the $4 million trust fund, transferring all executive control directly back to my father. "Sign right there," Caldwell instructed, his tone dropping to a patronizing murmur. "You are backed into a corner." We have a sworn medical affidavit from a licensed psychiatric professional. We have a solid legal argument against your unverified video. If we go before a federal magistrate, you will lose everything and face criminal charges. Be smart. Save yourself the humiliation and sign the paper. I kept my eyes glued to the gold pen. My hands continued to shake, rattling the edge of the legal pad. I let out a jagged, uneven breath that sounded exactly like a woman on the verge of a panic attack. I slowly turned my head toward Harrison, my expression a mask of pure, manufactured despair. I looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, performing the exact role of a naive civilian who realized she was severely outmatched by high-priced corporate sharks. I guess I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. I guess we will just have to see what the judge says. I pushed the gold pen away. It rolled across the glass table and bumped against Caldwell's briefcase. I did not sign the paper. I just pulled my trembling hands back into my lap and stared at the floor. My father slammed his hand on the table, an explosive sound that made the court stenographer jump in her seat. "Have it your way," he growled, his face twisting with genuine disgust. "You always were stubborn and entirely useless. We are done here, Caldwell. File the emergency injunction this afternoon. I want her assets frozen completely by tomorrow morning. I want her sleeping on the streets before the weekend. Let the judge throw her in a federal holding cell for all I care." Caldwell nodded sharply, aggressively, sweeping the settlement papers back into his leather briefcase and snapping the gold clasps shut. He glared at Harrison, shaking his head in professional mockery. "You should advise your client better, counselor," Caldwell sneered. "She is walking straight into a brick wall." Jamal let out a final booming laugh that echoed in the sterile room. He walked toward the double doors, buttoning his custom jacket with an air of absolute invincibility. "Good luck in court, Naomi," Jamal mocked, looking over his shoulder. "I highly recommend you start researching public defenders. You are going to need one when we are finished with you." Caroline stood up, smoothing her expensive dress. She walked past my table, refusing to even look at me, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "You really are pathetic," she muttered, following her husband out the door. My father was the last to leave. He stood at the threshold of the conference room, looking down at me with cold, lifeless eyes. He had no remorse. He had no paternal affection. He only saw a financial obstacle that he was about to bulldoze. "I will see you in court," he stated flatly. "And then I will erase you from this family completely." He turned on his heel and walked out. The heavy glass double doors swung shut behind him, clicking firmly into place and sealing the room. The aggressive footsteps of my family echoed down the marble hallway, growing fainter and fainter, until there was nothing but absolute silence. The court stenographer quietly packed up her transcription machine, eager to leave the hostile environment. She slipped out the side door, giving me a brief, sympathetic glance before vanishing. The moment the latch clicked shut, securing the room, my trembling stopped instantly. The fragile, terrified posture I had held for the last 10 minutes evaporated. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back and relaxing my jaw. The manufactured tears in my eyes dried up, leaving a cold, calculating stare. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as my true demeanor surfaced. Harrison sat back in his leather chair, crossing his legs and resting his hands on his lap. He did not look like a defeated lawyer. He looked like a predator admiring a perfectly executed hunt. He turned his head and met my gaze, a sharp, dangerous smile playing on his lips. I looked at the empty chairs across the table where my family had just sat. Then I turned my head to look directly at Harrison. My voice was no longer a frightened whisper. It was sharp, clear, and laced with absolute authority. "Did the stenographer get all of Jamal's statements under oath?" I asked. Harrison nodded slowly, his smile widening into a grin. "Every single word," he confirmed. "She captured the entire rant. He definitively stated on the official legal record that your mother lacked any mental capacity to make financial decisions. He emphatically verified their submitted medical affidavit as absolute truth." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass table and clasping my hands together. My face felt like solid ice. Perfect, I said, my tone dropping to a low, lethal register. They just formally locked themselves into perjury. The fluorescent lights of the United States District Courtroom buzzed with a low, sterile frequency. The preliminary hearing from Act 1 had escalated into a full-blown evidentiary showdown. Judge Abernathy sat high on the bench, her expression carved from granite. She had indulged the defense attorney's aggressive posturing during the initial session, but today the atmosphere was distinctly different. The stakes had been raised to their absolute highest. My father Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, his face a mask of solemn manufactured grief. Caroline sat in the first row of the gallery, twisting a designer handkerchief between her manicured fingers, her eyes darting nervously between the judge and the witness stand. And on that stand sat Jamal. He had sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, under the direct penalty of federal perjury. He adjusted the lapels of his custom suit, radiating an arrogant, bulletproof confidence. He was in his element. He was the golden boy of investment banking, the smooth-talking financial savant who could spin numbers into whatever narrative his clients desired. And today, his client was his father-in-law, and the objective was my complete financial and personal destruction. Caldwell, my father's aggressive litigator, approached the podium. He did not yell today. He adopted a respectful, almost deferential tone, treating Jamal like a hostile environment's only source of objective truth. Mr. Jamal Caldwell began projecting his voice to ensure the entire courtroom caught every syllable. Let us establish your professional credentials for the record. You are a senior director at a premier global investment bank, correct? That is correct, Jamal answered, his voice smooth and resonant. I oversee a portfolio exceeding $2 billion, specializing in complex asset management, international wealth transfers, and high net worth estate planning. I hold multiple advanced degrees in finance, and I am a licensed fiduciary. Caldwell nodded, pacing slowly before the jury box, though this was a bench trial. The performance was entirely for the judge. Impressive credentials indeed. Now, in your expert professional capacity, you reviewed the financial anomalies surrounding the late Mrs. Richards' trust fund, the fund that the defendant Naomi currently claims to control. I did? Jamal replied, leaning forward slightly, engaging directly with the judge. Your Honor, when I initiated a standard forensic review of the estate, I uncovered a series of deeply troubling irregularities. The $4 million did not simply sit in a standard holding account. The funds were subjected to a rapid, highly sophisticated process known as layering. I sat perfectly still beside Harrison, listening to Jamal weave his intricate web of lies. Layering was a specific term used in money laundering, where funds are moved through a series of complex transactions to obscure their origin. Jamal was projecting his own criminal methodology onto me. Could you explain that process for the court? Caldwell asked, feigning innocent curiosity. Certainly, Jamal said, gesturing with his hands. The defendant utilized a network of decentralized digital wallets and rapid automated wire transfers. She fractured the $4 million into thousands of micro-transactions, bouncing them across multiple domestic jurisdictions within a 48-hour window. This is a classic evasion tactic designed specifically to blind the primary estate executors and prevent standard banking algorithms from tracking the capital flight. He was good. I had to give him that. To a judge without a background in forensic accounting, his explanation sounded entirely plausible. It painted me not as a bumbling amateur, but as a malicious saboteur executing a scorched earth campaign against my own family. And in your expert opinion, Caldwell pressed, what was the purpose of this complex evasion? Jamal paused, letting a look of profound disappointment wash over his features. Your Honor, he said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic murmur. Naomi has spent her entire life harboring a deep-seated, irrational resentment toward her father and my wife. She has never participated in the family business. She lacks any formal financial education. She does not possess the cognitive capacity or the professional literacy to legitimately manage an estate of this magnitude. He locked eyes with the judge, his expression a portrait of earnest concern. She is not investing this money. She is not preserving her mother's legacy. She is hiding the funds out of pure spite, deliberately starving her father's legitimate real estate developments of crucial operating capital. If this court does not intervene and return control of the trust to the primary estate, she will succeed in destroying decades of this family's hard work. Caldwell turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom remained completely silent. Jamal sat back in the witness chair adjusting his tie, a faint, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had delivered the perfect narrative. He had established his own unimpeachable expertise while simultaneously branding me as an incompetent, vindictive thief. He thought he had just won the entire case. He thought he had driven the final nail into my coffin, ensuring the $4 million would be safely rerouted into his waiting hands. Judge Abernathy looked down at the defense table, her gaze severe and unforgiving. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her tone indicating she was nearing the end of her patience with this dispute. "Do you wish to cross-examine this witness?" Harrison did not immediately stand up. He took his time carefully capping his fountain pen and placing it on his legal pad. He adjusted his glasses, looking over the rim at Jamal. The arrogant smirk on my brother-in-law's face remained firmly in place. "Yes, Your Honor." Harrison finally said, his voice calm and terrifyingly polite. "The defense has a few questions for the financial expert." Harrison pushed his chair back and rose. He moved slowly. He adjusted his tailored jacket, buttoning it with a deliberate precision that commanded attention. He picked up a thick, heavy stack of printed financial ledgers. The stack was bound with thick, black binder clips. It looked like a finalized autopsy report of a corporate empire. He walked toward the podium, positioned halfway between the tables. Jamal watched him approach, the confident smirk still etched onto his handsome face. Jamal adjusted his silk tie, shifting his weight in the wooden chair, completely convinced that he was about to intellectually dismantle whatever flimsy defense my lawyer had prepared. He expected questions about my mother. He expected questions about the trust fund. He expected Harrison to beg for a concession. Mr. Jamal Harrison began, his voice projecting a calm, authoritative cadence. "Let us revisit your earlier testimony. You stated under oath that you are a senior director at a premier global investment bank. You testified that you possess multiple advanced degrees in finance and hold an active fiduciary license. You also presented yourself today as the foremost financial expert regarding your father-in-law, Richard's domestic real estate development firm. Is all of that still accurate?" "That is entirely accurate," Counselor Jamal answered, leaning into the microphone. "I manage complex asset structures daily. My expertise is precisely why I recognize the glaring anomalies in your client's unauthorized liquidation of the trust." Harrison nodded slowly, flipping open the heavy-bound ledger on the podium. He did not look up. He traced a line of data with his index finger. "Your expertise is exactly what I want to discuss today," Harrison said. "Because a financial expert of your caliber, who oversees billions of dollars, would certainly maintain an intimate working knowledge of the primary accounts associated with his own family business, especially a business that claims to be suffering a sudden, unexplainable liquidity crisis." Richard shifted uneasily at the plaintiff table. Caldwell furrowed his heavy brow, leaning forward. This line of questioning was veering entirely off the anticipated script. Jamal narrowed his eyes, the first micro-expression of uncertainty flickering across his confident features. "I am familiar with the macro-financial health of the family business," Jamal answered cautiously. "But my primary focus today is the stolen $4 million belonging to the estate." "We will get to the $4 million shortly," Harrison promised, his voice sharpening into a lethal blade. "But right now, I need you to apply your undeniable financial brilliance to a much larger mathematical anomaly." Harrison picked up the top document from the ledger, holding it up for the judge to see. "Mr. Jamal, you claim Naomi is financially illiterate. You claim she utilized unauthorized layering tactics. Yet as a brilliant investment banker, can you explain how exactly $12 million vanished from your father-in-law's domestic corporate accounts and reappeared in an offshore shell company in Panama exactly 24 months ago. The silence that slammed into the courtroom was absolute and deafening. It was the kind of vacuum that occurs right before a massive explosion. On the witness stand, the arrogant sneer completely evaporated from Jamal's face. His dark eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered terror. He stared at the piece of paper in Harrison's hand, as if it were a live grenade. The color drained from his complexion, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The smooth-talking financial savant suddenly looked like a trapped animal staring into the headlights of an oncoming freight train. At the plaintiff table, Richard let out a choked, gasping sound. He gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard his knuckles bruised. Caldwell spun his head around, staring at his client in absolute shock, realizing instantly that he had been dragged into a federal courtroom to defend a massive criminal money laundering syndicate without his knowledge. The pristine narrative they had spent weeks building was disintegrating into dust right before his eyes. On the stand, Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard. I am not familiar with, he stammered, his voice pitching up an octave, stripping away all his previous baritone authority. Sweat broke out across his forehead. He reached a trembling hand to loosen his custom silk tie, suddenly finding it difficult to draw oxygen into his lungs. His bulletproof Wall Street persona shattered. Harrison did not let him breathe. He flipped to the next page, reading the data aloud with merciless precision. Routing number ending in 4829. Transfer authorized via a secure proxy server utilizing your specific executive banking credentials. The destination is a registered Panamanian entity listed as an anonymous holding corporation. $12 million, Mr. Jamal. Siphoned directly from domestic investors and washed clean through your international networks. Tell the court again how my client is the one executing illegal wire transfers. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Caroline vaulted up from her seat in the first row of the gallery, her face twisted into a mask of pure hysterical rage. She pointed a shaking finger at Harrison, her designer handbag crashing to the floor. "You are lying!" Caroline screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "You are fabricating documents. My husband is honest. You are trying to frame him to protect that thief sitting at the table." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with the force of a gunshot. "Order!" Judge Abernathy roared, her voice cutting through the escalating frenzy. "Order in this federal court right now, or I will have the gallery cleared by the bailiffs." Caroline continued to sob loudly, clutching the wooden railing separating the gallery from the trial floor. Richard stared straight ahead, his chest heaving, his entire fraudulent empire crumbling before his very eyes. And on the stand, Jamal sat completely paralyzed, dripping with sweat, unable to form a single coherent sentence as the devastating reality of his federal exposure locked him firmly in its jaws. Caldwell finally broke free from his state of absolute shock. The high-priced corporate litigator realized that his client was seconds away from incriminating himself on federal money laundering charges right in the middle of a civil probate hearing. Caldwell leaped up from the plaintiff table, his chair crashing backward onto the carpeted floor. "Objection!" he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic and adrenaline. "Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning is wildly inappropriate and entirely irrelevant to the matter of the trust fund. You cannot ambush a witness with wild accusations of corporate fraud." Harrison stood firm at the podium, his hand still resting on the printed ledgers. "It is highly relevant to the credibility of the witness, Your Honor," Harrison countered smoothly. "The plaintiff called this man to the stand as an unimpeachable financial expert. I am simply questioning the integrity of his financial expertise." Caldwell marched out from behind his table, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at the thick stack of papers in Harrison's hands. "Furthermore, Your Honor, those financial documents were never entered into discovery. We have not been provided with any advance notice of this exhibit. I demand to know how opposing counsel obtained internal corporate banking records belonging to my client's private enterprise. Those documents were obtained without a subpoena." They are a blatant violation of strict banking privacy laws and corporate confidentiality agreements. The courtroom dynamic shifted instantly. The raw panic that had gripped my father and brother-in-law suddenly morphed into a desperate, clinging hope. Jamal wiped the thick layer of sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand, his eyes darting toward Caldwell. The arrogant investment banker realized his lawyer had just thrown him a life preserver. If Caldwell could get the evidence thrown out on a procedural technicality, Jamal could walk out of this courtroom a free man. Judge Abernathy lowered her gavel and turned her piercing gaze toward my defense table. The righteous fury she had directed at the disruptive gallery was now focused entirely on my attorney. The federal court system operated on strict procedural rules, and Caldwell had just invoked one of the most sacred protections in corporate law. Mr. Harrison, the judge said, her voice dangerously low and resonant. Counsel raises a highly valid point. You are attempting to introduce proprietary banking ledgers that detail multi-million-dollar offshore transfers. I have not signed any judicial order authorizing the seizure of these specific corporate records. Did you obtain a civil subpoena for this financial data? I sat perfectly still beside the empty chair where Harrison had been sitting. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. This was the exact bottleneck we had anticipated. In a standard civil dispute, obtaining those offshore records would require months of litigation, international subpoenas, and endless appeals. Caldwell knew this. Richard knew this. They were banking on the impenetrable fortress of international banking privacy to shield their criminal syndicate from a simple probate judge. Harrison looked up at the bench, his expression perfectly neutral. Your Honor, my client came into possession of these records independently, he stated, choosing his words with surgical precision. We are offering them solely to impeach the character and credibility of the witness currently on the stand. Caldwell let out a loud theatrical bark of laughter, throwing his arms up in the air. Independently, he mocked, turning to face the gallery to ensure everyone heard his indignation. Your Honor, this is absolute absurdity. The defense is openly admitting to corporate espionage. Naomi is an unemployed shut-in who illegally hacked into a private banking server to steal proprietary data. She is committing cybercrimes to distract this court from her actual theft of the $4 million trust. I move for an immediate sanction against the defense. My father Richard sat up straighter at his table. The color began to return to his cheeks. He adjusted his silk tie and let out a long, slow breath. He shot me a venomous, triumphant glare from across the aisle. In his mind, he had just dodged a massive bullet. He believed that the shield of high-priced corporate litigation had once again protected him from accountability. Judge Abernathy adjusted her reading glasses, her lips pressed into a thin, severe line. She looked at the printed ledgers on the podium and then looked directly at Harrison. The rules of evidence in this courtroom are not optional, Mr. Harrison. She admonished, her tone echoing with absolute finality. You cannot ambush a witness with illegally obtained financial documents, no matter how relevant you believe them to be. The protections afforded by banking privacy laws apply even in this venue. She raised her wooden gavel high into the air. Mr. Harrison, unless you have a federal warrant or a subpoena authorizing the seizure of these documents, they are entirely inadmissible in this civil dispute. The gavel slammed down onto the wooden-sounding block, sealing the decision. The sharp crack echoed off the marble walls, finalizing my apparent defeat. I sustain the objection. Judge Abernathy declared, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. The clerk is ordered to strike the previous line of questioning regarding the offshore accounts from the official record. At the witness stand, Jamal let out a massive breath of relief, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. He leaned back in his chair, the arrogant smirk slowly crawling back onto his face. Across the aisle, Caldwell buttoned his suit jacket and returned to the plaintiff table, looking like a conquering hero. They had survived the ambush, using the strict rules of the legal system to suppress the truth. They genuinely believed that they had stripped me of my only weapon, and that my total destruction was now completely inevitable. The gallery murmured. They thought the roadblock saved their criminal empire. Jamal spoke. Your Honor, Naomi lacks cognitive capacity to manage these funds. She hides the money from pure spite, endangering her father's businesses. Your Honor. Naomi lacks cognitive capacity to manage these funds. Jamal repeated, his voice echoing in the large marble room. He sat up straighter, leaning into the microphone, with the practiced ease of a man who had just narrowly escaped the guillotine. She is hiding the money from pure spite, deliberately endangering her father's legitimate businesses. Caldwell stood beside the plaintiff table, looking entirely satisfied. He nodded along with his witness, playing the role of the deeply concerned legal advocate. The sudden suppression of Harrison's evidence had completely reinvigorated their offensive strategy. Richard wiped the lingering sheen of cold sweat from his forehead, letting out a long, dramatic exhale. He looked across the aisle at me, a twisted smirk breaking through his performance of a grieving widower. He genuinely believed he had just checkmated us. He thought the wall of banking privacy laws had saved his criminal enterprise and doomed my defense. In the gallery, Caroline let out an audible sigh of relief. She leaned back against the wooden bench, shooting me a look of absolute venomous triumph. Her husband had survived the ambush. Her father was back in control. In her mind, I was just moments away from being escorted out of the building in handcuffs. She whispered something to the socialite friend sitting beside her, and they both let out a quiet, mocking laugh. Judge Abernathy was not laughing. She was furious. The federal magistrate felt she had just witnessed a blatant abuse of her courtroom by a rogue defense attorney, attempting a baseless smear campaign. She slammed her hands down on the polished mahogany bench, leaning forward to direct her wrath entirely at my defense table. Mr. Harrison, the judge, began, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. You have tested the absolute limits of my patience today. This court is not a theater for baseless character assassination. You cannot bypass the fundamental rules of evidence simply because your client harbors deep-seated family resentments. Harrison stood perfectly still, accepting the judicial reprimand with the stoic discipline of a seasoned prosecutor. He did not argue, he did not apologize. He simply took his seat beside me. To the untrained eye, it looked like a total unconditional surrender. Caldwell grinned widely, practically tasting the $4 million settlement. Judge Abernathy shifted her harsh, unyielding glare directly onto me. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, maintaining a neutral expression as the full weight of the federal justice system bore down on my shoulders. Ms. Naomi, the judge, declared, her tone leaving zero room for negotiation. Your counsel has attempted a baseless smear tactic to distract this court from the central issue at hand. The issue is the $4 million missing from your late mother's estate. You have repeatedly claimed that you are acting as the legal trustee, yet you have produced zero verified financial documentation demonstrating where those funds reside. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his table. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He wanted the judge to drop the hammer. I am giving you one final opportunity. Judge Abernathy warned, her eyes narrowing behind her reading glasses. If you cannot provide immediate legal documentation proving exactly where the $4 million trust currently resides, I will hold you in direct contempt of this court. I will issue an immediate judicial order to freeze all of your personal and professional assets. And I will formally refer your case to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution on charges of grand larceny and elder financial abuse. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The judge had drawn the line in the sand. I was out of time. I was out of procedural delays. The threat of criminal prosecution meant that I would be taken into federal custody today if I did not produce the money. The finality of her warning was designed to force a panicked confession. The entire gallery went dead silent. The murmured conversations and the rustling of papers ceased completely. Every single person in that courtroom was holding their breath, waiting to see if the jobless loser would finally break under the immense pressure of a federal judge. At the witness stand, Jamal straightened his custom silk tie. He looked down at me from his elevated position, his dark eyes gleaming with vicious satisfaction. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought his secret accounts were safe. Caroline smirked, leaning forward in the front row. She was ready to watch the bailiff slap handcuffs on my wrists. She wanted to see me humiliated, destroyed, and dragged away so she could go back to living her lavish life. My father Richard stared at me with cold, dead eyes. The smirk on his face was a promise of total annihilation. He adjusted his expensive custom suit jacket, confident that his wealth had insulated his criminal empire. I looked at the empty glass of water on my table. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, conditioned oxygen fill my lungs. The tedious game of civilian probate law was officially over. It was finally time to change the rules of engagement. I placed both of my hands flat on the polished wooden table. I pushed my chair back, the scraping sound echoing loudly in the silent room. I stood up slowly, deliberately taking my time. I reached down and buttoned the center button of my gray blazer. I squared my shoulders, standing with the rigid, upright discipline of a federal agent. I stepped out from behind the defendant table, leaving the safety of my legal counsel. I walked toward the center of the room, stopping just behind the podium where Harrison had stood moments before. I looked directly into Judge Abernathy's harsh, uncompromising eyes, meeting her gaze. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying a commanding resonance that instantly shattered the quiet tension of the room. "May I approach the bench?" Judge Abernathy blinked. The sudden shift in my posture and the absolute lack of fear in my voice momentarily derailed her judicial fury. A defendant facing imminent arrest for grand larceny was supposed to cower. They were supposed to weep, beg for leniency, or frantically consult their attorney. They were not supposed to stand with the rigid, disciplined posture of a tactical operative and request to approach the bench. The judge looked at Harrison, who remained seated, completely unbothered. Then she looked back at me. Her gavel hovered over the sounding block. "You may approach," she said, her voice laced with deep suspicion, "but I warn you right now. This had better not be another attempt to circumvent the rules of evidence." I walked forward, my flat shoes making no sound on the carpeted floor. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the elevated wooden bench, planting my feet firmly. The entire courtroom leaned in. I could feel the collective breath of the gallery hitching. Caroline stopped, whispering to her friend. Jamal leaned forward in the witness chair, his dark eyes narrowing, as he tried to calculate what desperate final play I could possibly be making. Caldwell stood frozen at the plaintiff table, his legal instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. I did not address the gallery. I did not look at my attorney. I kept my gaze locked squarely on the federal magistrate sitting above me. "Your Honor," I began, my voice ringing out with a commanding, chilling authority that cut through the sterile air of the courtroom. "My father stated under oath that I have not worked a single day in my life. He sat on that witness stand and swore to this court that I am a useless parasite who has spent the last decade hiding in a basement, relying entirely on his generosity to survive." I paused, letting the weight of those previous accusations settle over the room. I turned my head slowly, looking back over my shoulder. My eyes bypassed my father. They bypassed Caldwell. I locked eyes directly with Jamal. The arrogant investment banker stared back at me, his confident smirk replaced by a sudden creeping dread. He recognized the shift in my demeanor. He realized in that split second that he was not looking at a terrified civilian. He was looking at a predator who had just finished playing with her food. He is right that I have not worked for him. I continued, turning my attention back to the judge. I have never been an employee of his fraudulent real estate enterprise, but I am not unemployed. I reached inside the inner pocket of my gray blazer. The movement was slow, deliberate, and completely non-threatening. Caldwell gasped, taking a half step forward as if to object, but he was too paralyzed by confusion to speak. I pulled out a small black leather wallet. I flipped it open and placed it flat on the wooden ledge of the judge bench. Inside the leather casing sat a solid gold badge alongside a secure federal identification card. "I am a supervisory forensic accountant for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network," I declared, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "United States Department of the Treasury." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of total vacuum that precedes a catastrophic implosion. Judge Abernathy stared at the gold shield resting on her bench. She leaned forward, pushing her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose to examine the federal credentials. The seal of the Department of the Treasury gleamed under the fluorescent lights. My security clearance level and my official government designation were printed in undeniable stark black ink. Behind me, a sharp, wet gasp shattered the silence. It was my father. Richard gripped the edge of the plaintiff table, his knuckles turning a bruised purple. All the blood instantly vanished from his face, leaving him a chalky, sickening white. His mouth hung open, forming a silent scream of sheer terror. The billionaire real estate developer, the man who had spent his entire life bullying and belittling me, suddenly looked like a fragile, terrified old man. He finally understood why I never cared about his money. He finally realized why I never attended his flashy country club dinners. I was a federal agent, and he was a walking, breathing target. Jamal gripped the wooden rails of the witness box. His knuckles popped. His dark skin went ashen. The slick Wall Street executive, the man who had frozen my civilian bank accounts and mocked me in this very room, was suddenly struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs. The realization slammed into him with the force of a freight train. The $12 million he had wired to Panama was not hidden. The email he had received from internal compliance was not a glitch. He had been playing a high-stakes game of financial chess against a federal operative who specialized in dismantling transnational syndicates. Caroline shrieked from the gallery, a loud, piercing wail of absolute disbelief. She grabbed her designer handbag, clutching it to her chest, as if the expensive leather could protect her from the reality collapsing around her. The golden child who had spent her entire life treating me like garbage was now staring at an officer of the federal government. Judge Abernathy slowly looked up from my badge. Her harsh, unyielding glare was completely gone. In its place was a look of profound, intense realization. The federal magistrate instantly understood the magnitude of what was happening in her civil courtroom. She looked at me, her posture shifting from a scolding judge to a colleague within the justice system. "Agent," she said, her voice dropping to a serious professional murmur. "What exactly is going on in my courtroom?" I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight. I looked back at Jamal, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. Then I looked at my father, watching him tremble in his custom-tailored suit. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting clearly so that every single person in the gallery could hear the final nail being driven into their coffins. "The $4 million you have been asked to locate was never stolen. It was never illegally liquidated, and it was never hidden out of spite." Caldwell dropped his legal pad. It hit the floor with a soft thud. He backed away from his client, putting physical distance between himself and my father. The high-priced lawyer knew exactly what was coming next. He wanted absolutely no part of the federal hammer that was about to drop. 3 months ago, I continued maintaining absolute eye contact with the judge. Under the strict authorization of a federal magistrate, that money was legally converted into bait funds. My mother willingly signed the authorization before her passing. She knew exactly what she was doing. We used that money to track a transnational money laundering syndicate. A syndicate operated by the men sitting in this very room. The absolute stillness in the courtroom shattered. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings. Richard gripped the edge of the plaintiff table so tightly I thought the thick mahogany would splinter under his hands. His mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, a desperate fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence was completely annihilated. Behind him, Caroline let out a high-pitched, whining noise, shaking her head back and forth as if trying to physically reject the reality unfolding before her eyes. Jamal remained frozen in the witness box, the sweat now visibly rolling down his temples and soaking into the collar of his expensive custom-tailored shirt. The smooth-talking investment banker was calculating his exposure, and the mathematics of his impending doom were catastrophic. I stepped back from the bench, allowing Harrison to step forward. My attorney, the man my family had dismissed as a cheap contingency lawyer, moved with the predatory grace of an apex predator closing in for the kill. He did not say a single word at first. He simply unlatched the heavy brass locks of his leather briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed like a countdown clock. Harrison reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy folder. It was not a standard legal envelope. It was wrapped tightly in bright red tamper, evident security tape. Stamped aggressively across the front in bold black ink was the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Directly beneath the eagle emblem, the word "classified" blared in capitalized crimson letters. The sheer visual impact of that red tape in a standard civil probate court was like dropping a live grenade onto a dining room table. Caldwell, the high-priced corporate shark Richard had hired, took another distinct step backward. He literally raised his hands in the air, a universal gesture of complete and utter surrender. He was formally detaching himself from the sinking ship. Harrison walked right past the retreating lawyer and approached the bench. "Your Honor," Harrison declared, his voice echoing with absolute federal authority, "I am submitting into evidence a certified dossier compiled by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This document details the exact trajectory of the $12 million previously mentioned, as well as the wire transfers authorized by the individual currently sitting in your witness box. It contains offshore bank routing numbers, encrypted communication logs, and the specific Panamanian shell company tax identification numbers." Harrison held the heavy classified folder out toward Judge Abernathy. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Harrison continued, keeping his eyes locked on the magistrate, "this dossier contains the authorized federal warrants that permitted Agent Naomi to utilize her late mother's estate as a financial snare. The $4 million is currently secured in a federal holding account at the Department of the Treasury. It was never stolen, it was bait, and the targets took it." Harrison handed the folder over the polished wooden ledge. Judge Abernathy took the heavy dossier. Her hands, usually so swift and decisive, moved with slow, deliberate caution. She recognized the red tape. She understood the massive jurisdictional shift that had just occurred in her courtroom. A simple dispute over a family will had instantly morphed into a federal criminal takedown. The entire room held its collective breath. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents and the ragged, panicked breathing coming from my father. Judge Abernathy picked up a silver letter opener from her desk. She slid the sharp metal edge under the red tamper evident tape and sliced it open. The tearing sound ripped through the silent room. She flipped open the heavy manila cover. Her stern eyes scanned the first page, then she flipped to the second page. Her expression, already severe, turned incredibly dark. The judicial frustration she had previously aimed at me completely vanished. In its place was a look of profound, uncompromising fury, directed entirely at the men sitting across the aisle. She was reading the undeniable proof that these men had used her civil courtroom to further a criminal money laundering conspiracy. They had committed egregious perjury right in front of her. Richard began to hyperventilate. He tugged frantically at his silk tie, trying to loosen it around his thickening neck. He looked at Caldwell, his eyes silently begging for a legal objection, a loophole, a lifeline. Caldwell simply looked away, refusing to make eye contact with a man about to be indicted under federal racketeering laws. In the gallery, Caroline stood up, her designer heels clicking frantically. "Dad," she cried out, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Dad, what is happening? What did you do? Make them stop." My father could not answer her. He just stared at the judge, watching his entire legacy, his wealth, his reputation burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. In the witness box, Jamal was shaking. He knew the routing data was real. The fight or flight response kicked in. Judge Abernathy closed the folder, placing her hands flat on the seal. She looked up, and her gaze was lethal. She raised her gavel high into the air. She brought it down with ferocity. The crack slammed against the block, echoing like a gunshot. "This court is now moving into executive session," Judge Abernathy roared, her voice vibrating with absolute command. Bailiffs, lock the doors. No unauthorized personnel are to leave this room. Jamal did not wait. Panic overrode his logical mind. He vaulted over the wooden gate, scrambling for traction. He sprinted down the aisle, shoving past his wife. Caroline screamed as he knocked her aside. He lunged toward the oak doors, reaching frantically for the handles, but he was too slow. The bailiffs intercepted him, stepping squarely in front of the exit. They crossed their arms, blocking the doors, forming a solid wall. Jamal slammed into them, bouncing backward and stumbling to the floor, trapped. Jamal lay sprawled on the carpeted floor of the center aisle, gasping for air, as the reality of his confinement crushed the last remnants of his arrogance. He scrambled backward like a cornered crab, his custom suit jacket tearing at the seam as his shoulders scraped against the wooden pews. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The two bailiffs stood like granite statues, blocking the heavy double doors, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. The courtroom was entirely sealed. Then a loud mechanical buzz echoed from the electronic locks of those same double doors. The bailiffs stepped aside simultaneously, parting like the Red Sea. The heavy oak doors swung open outward, propelled by a force that made the heavy hinges groan. 3 Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents marched into the room. They did not wear the standard neat civilian suits typically seen in television dramas. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy utility vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI across their chests, and secured holsters strapped to their thighs. Their boots hit the marble floor of the vestibule and transitioned to the carpeted aisle with synchronized heavy thuds. They moved with a terrifying mechanical precision, a unified force of federal authority coming to collect their targets. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe buzz cut, stepped right over Jamal, who was still cowering on the floor. The agent did not even look down. He marched directly toward the plaintiff table where my father sat, completely paralyzed. The second agent moved swiftly to the side, flanking Jamal, and grabbing him by the collar of his torn suit jacket, hauling him to his feet with effortless, brutal strength. I stood tall behind the defense podium, buttoning my blazer. I looked down at the 2 men who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, insignificant, and worthless. The absolute terror radiating from their faces was the most intoxicating, profound validation I had ever experienced. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The total silence in the room amplified every single syllable I spoke. For 5 years, my family thought I was an antisocial failure hiding in my room. I declared, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, carrying the absolute weight of the federal government. You told your wealthy friends I was a jobless parasite. You mocked my clothes, my lifestyle, and my supposed incompetence. In reality, I was tracing the $12 million Richard defrauded from his domestic investors. The same $12 million that Jamal washed through his Panama shell company using his executive banking credentials. Richard began to shake violently. His jaw trembled, his mouth opening and closing, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The facade of the untouchable billionaire real estate developer was entirely annihilated. He was just a terrified old man, realizing he was about to spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. You thought you were financial geniuses? I continued, stepping out from behind the podium and walking slowly toward the center of the room. You thought your offshore networks were invisible to a girl who supposedly did not know how to pay a utility bill. But your greed made you sloppy. Your arrogance made you predictable. The $4 million trust was never a simple inheritance. It was the bait you could not resist attempting to seize. We needed you to make a desperate, aggressive move to link your domestic accounts directly to your international laundering operation. You walked right into the snare. The second agent slammed Jamal face first against the polished wooden wall of the gallery. Jamal let out a high-pitched yelp of pain as his cheek smashed against the hard oak. The agent yanked Jamal's arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the sound of absolute finality. The sound of a corrupt Wall Street career ending instantly and irrevocably. No, Jamal sobbed, his voice cracking as the cold steel bit into his wrists. No, please, this is a mistake. I was just following orders. Richard told me to do it. He forced me to transfer the funds. I will testify against him. I will give you everything. He was selling out his father-in-law before the Miranda rights were even fully read. The complete lack of loyalty among thieves was always a pathetic, predictable spectacle. At the plaintiff table, the lead agent grabbed my father by the shoulder. "Caldwell, do something!" My father screamed, finally finding his voice. His eyes darted wildly toward his high-priced corporate litigator. "Caldwell, do something. File an injunction. Stop them. You are my lawyer. Do your job." Caldwell, the aggressive legal shark, who had spent the entire morning trying to humiliate me and destroy my mother's legacy, literally took 3 large steps backward. He held both of his hands high up in the air, his palms facing outward in a universal gesture of total surrender and complete disengagement. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "I am a civil probate attorney," Caldwell stated, his voice loud and clear, ensuring the federal agents and the judge heard him properly. "I do not represent clients involved in federal racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act violations. I want absolutely nothing to do with a federal money laundering indictment. You lied to me about your financials. You lied to me about the medical affidavit. I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately." Caldwell grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, snapped the gold clasps shut, and practically ran toward the side exit of the courtroom, wanting to put as much distance between himself and the sinking criminal ship as humanly possible. He abandoned his client without a second thought, leaving my father completely isolated and entirely defenseless. The heavy wooden side door slammed shut behind the fleeing attorney, severing my father's last remaining tie to the civilized world. The lead federal agent did not waste a single second watching the lawyer retreat. He grabbed my father by the lapels of his custom charcoal suit and spun him around, pressing him face first against the polished mahogany of the plaintiff table. Richard let out a muffled, pathetic groan as the breath was forced from his lungs. The agent kicked my father's legs apart, forcing him into a wide, vulnerable stance before forcefully pulling his arms behind his back. The cold steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The metallic clicks echoed in the dead silence of the courtroom, finalizing the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent declared, his voice projecting with practiced mechanical authority. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." My father did not fight back. He did not yell. He simply hung his head, his silver hair falling disheveled across his sweaty forehead, completely broken by the sudden, inescapable reality of his federal indictment. Across the aisle, the second agent hauled Jamal up from the floor. The smooth-talking investment banker was openly weeping now, his tears mixing with the sweat and dirt on his bruised face. His expensive silk tie was torn and twisted around his neck, resembling a hangman's noose. He babbled incoherently, begging for a plea deal, offering to surrender every single offshore account if they would just let him go. The agents ignored his pathetic bargaining. They gripped the 2 men by their biceps and began the long, humiliating frog march down the center aisle of the courtroom. I stood behind the defense podium, watching them walk the gauntlet. For 33 years, these men had commanded every room they entered. They had ruled my family with financial terrorism and psychological cruelty. Now they were being paraded like common street criminals, stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their freedom. Judge Abernathy watched from the high bench, her face a mask of uncompromising judicial satisfaction. She had witnessed the federal trap snap shut, and she approved of the outcome. As the agents dragged my father and my brother-in-law past the gallery, the illusion of my sister's perfect life violently shattered. Caroline had been standing paralyzed, gripping the wooden railing with white knuckles. She watched her husband weeping and her father shuffling in handcuffs. The reality of the federal seizure finally registered in her mind. Her lavish lifestyle, her social media empire, her endless shopping sprees, all of it had been funded by the dirty money Jamal and Richard had just been arrested for laundering. She realized instantly that the government would not stop with them. The federal asset forfeiture protocols would sweep through everything they owned. Caroline let out a guttural, desperate wail. She scrambled over the wooden barrier, abandoning all grace and socialite decorum. Her designer handbag, a limited edition piece she had bought with stolen investor funds, slipped from her shoulder and crashed to the carpeted floor, spilling expensive cosmetics and gold credit cards everywhere. She did not even look back at it. She sprinted across the trial floor, her high heels stumbling on the carpet directly toward my defense table. "Naomi," she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, frantic pitch. "Naomi, please, you have to stop them!" She threw herself at me, lunging across the space and grabbing my forearm with both hands. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug painfully through the fabric of my gray blazer. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute primal terror. She was no longer the arrogant golden child who had mocked me in the coffee shop just days prior. She was a terrified, desperate woman watching her entire universe burn to ash. "I am your sister," Caroline sobbed, gasping for air as she clung to my arm like a drowning victim. "You cannot do this to us. You have to tell them to stop. You have to help me, Naomi. My accounts are frozen. The bank apps are locked out. I cannot access anything. I have nothing left. Please, you have all that trust money. You have a government job. You have to save me." I looked down at her hands gripping my sleeve. I felt the frantic trembling in her fingers. I looked at her tear-stained face, pleading for a miraculous rescue. For my entire life, I had craved her affection. I had wanted a sister who loved me, a sister who would stand by my side against our father's cruelty. But Caroline had always chosen the money. She had happily participated in my abuse. She had cheered when I was thrown out into the freezing rain. She had laughed while trying to steal my mother's dying legacy. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No pity, no remorse, no familial obligation. The well of my empathy had run completely dry. I raised my free hand and deliberately coldly pried her fingers off my jacket one by one. I pushed her hands away, letting them drop back to her sides. I stepped back, creating a definitive physical boundary between my federal authority and her criminal complicity. "I am an agent of the federal government," I stated, my voice flat and devoid of any sisterly affection. "And your assets are currently being seized by the Department of Justice under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You are a beneficiary of a transnational laundering syndicate, Caroline. You have absolutely nothing because everything you owned was stolen." Caroline stared at me, her mouth trembling, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. She realized I was not going to save her. I was the one who had orchestrated her downfall. "Call an Uber, Caroline," I said, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet whisper. "Just like you told me to do on Thanksgiving." I turned my back on her. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back to see the devastation register on her face. I simply picked up my canvas tote bag and walked away. The sound of her hysterical wailing echoed through the large marble room, a pathetic symphony of consequences finally catching up to her. Harrison fell into step beside me, snapping his briefcase shut and offering a slight respectful nod. As we passed the bench, Judge Abernathy met my gaze. She gave a single slow nod of professional acknowledgement. The court had been served. The trap had worked flawlessly. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my head held high. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors. They swung shut behind me with a loud, definitive thud, cutting off the sounds of my sister's sobbing and sealing the darkest chapter of my life permanently in the past. I walked down the long marble corridor of the federal courthouse, my flat shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished stone. I passed the security checkpoints and pushed through the main exit doors. I stepped out onto the massive stone stairs, descending into the bright, vibrant sunlight of the modern city. The air outside was crisp clean and incredibly sweet. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations was completely gone. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer an outcast. At the bottom of the grand courthouse steps, a sleek black government SUV sat idling at the curb. The tinted windows rolled down, revealing the tactical team driver waiting for my extraction. I reached for the heavy door handle and pulled it open. I climbed into the back seat, settling into the dark, quiet leather interior. The doors locked automatically, securing me inside the protective bubble of my true life. As the heavy vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the rushing city traffic, I looked out the tinted window at the towering courthouse one last time. I had engineered the perfect trap. I had executed a flawless, total victory. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the headrest, and for the first time in 33 years, I finally felt entirely, completely free. The story of Naomi and her family's spectacular downfall is a thrilling ride, but beneath the cinematic courtroom drama lies a deeply relatable and profound lesson. The core takeaway is that your true worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. For her entire life, Naomi's father, sister, and brother-in-law viewed her through a lens of extreme arrogance. Because she refused to play their flashy, superficial games, they labeled her a failure and an outcast. They equated loud boasting and material wealth with power, completely blind to the reality that true strength is often silent. When pushed to the brink and kicked out into the freezing rain, Naomi did not waste her energy screaming back at them or begging for the approval she was always denied. Instead, she channeled the pain of their relentless rejection into building an undeniable, bulletproof reality for herself. This narrative teaches us the incredible value of quiet preparation and emotional detachment. When toxic people try to back you into a corner, the natural human instinct is to panic, argue, or fight back emotionally to prove your worth. Naomi did the exact opposite. She let her detractors dig their own graves with their blinding arrogance. She understood that you do not need to convince toxic individuals of your value. You simply need to secure your own independence and let the natural consequences of their actions catch up to them. Her ultimate victory was not just putting criminals behind bars, but the moment she stepped out into the sunlight, completely free from the need for her family's validation. We all face people who underestimate us, but our potential is not limited by their narrow vision. If you have ever had to quietly build your strength while others doubted your worth, share your journey in the comments below and subscribe to join our community of resilience.